In the autumn of 1537, the grand halls of Hampton Court Palace echoed with jubilation. Cannons roared over the River Thames, bells rang out from every church steeple, and the people of England celebrated what seemed like a divine miracle. King Henry VIII, after nearly 3 decades of political maneuvering, religious upheaval, and the downfall of 2 queens, finally had what he had longed for, a legitimate male heir. The birth of Prince Edward was proclaimed throughout the kingdom with unmatched fanfare. Bonfires lit the skies, feasts were prepared in every noble hall, and the court exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The Tudor dynasty, once teetering on the edge of uncertainty, now had its future secured. But while the kingdom celebrated, another story unfolded just beyond the public eye, a story far darker, hidden in the shadows of the king's triumph. In a lavishly adorned bedchamber deep inside Hampton Court, Queen Jane Seymour lay pale and trembling, her body racked with pain. She had given Henry the son he so desperately craved, but the price of that gift would be her life. Jane was bleeding heavily, her strength failing with each passing hour. And Henry, her husband, her king, was nowhere to be found. This was not the fairy tale ending history once painted. This was not the tale of a gentle queen dying peacefully in the arms of a mourning monarch. This was a slow, agonizing death, witnessed and ignored. Jane's cries faded into silence while the court turned its gaze toward the infant prince. Her sacrifice was immediate and complete. In the eyes of the Tudor world, she had served her purpose. She was now expendable. History often remembers Jane Seymour as Henry's favorite wife, the quiet, obedient woman who succeeded where others failed. She is immortalized as the mother of the future king, the one who gave Henry his heart's desire. But such remembrance is a distortion. The truth of her death was far more brutal, far more revealing of Henry's true nature. Contemporary sources suggest that Jane's condition was dire almost immediately after childbirth, and that her medical needs were quickly overshadowed by the demands of ensuring the prince's survival. Some accounts even hint that Henry coldly remarked, "Wives can be replaced, but a son cannot." For 12 days, Jane lingered in agony. The palace around her bustled not with concern for her health, but with preparations for Edward's christening. Physicians, under royal pressure, diverted their attention to the child. Jane faded into the background, a woman who had done her duty and could now be quietly discarded. When she finally passed, the nation mourned the queen, but their mourning was already mixed with gratitude for the prince she had left behind. The real tragedy, however, was that Jane Seymour was not just a victim of illness. She was a casualty of ambition, a life weighed and measured against a legacy. Her death wasn't merely the result of 16th-century medical limitations. It was the outcome of deliberate neglect, of a system that viewed women as vessels for male succession and nothing more. Henry's cold indifference in those final days reveals a chilling truth. Love, if it ever existed, was irrelevant when measured against power. Jane Seymour, a tool for the throne. She was never meant to be loved. In the grand narrative of Henry VIII's queens, Jane Seymour is often cast as the gentle, virtuous contrast to the tumultuous women who came before her. But this image is oft submissive, almost sentient, not truth. It is myth, crafted by centuries of propaganda and polished by generations of historians who chose comfort over complexity. The reality of Jane Seymour's rise was not romanticity, was ruthlessly calculated. She was chosen not for her heart, nor for her character, but for her body. After the downfall of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII found himself once again without a male heir. His desperation, already deepened by the political fallout of his split with Rome and the scandal surrounding Anne's execution, had reached a fever pitch. He needed a woman who could restore stability to his image, deliver a son quickly, and never challenge his authority. Jane Seymour, with her quiet demeanor, noble lineage, and perceived fertility, was the perfect solution. But make no mistake, Jane did not fall into this role passively. She was no naive girl pulled into courtly politics by accident. She was born into a family that understood the game of power and played it with precision. The Seymours were ambitious, and they saw opportunity in Henry's disillusionment with Anne. They presented Jane as the antidote to Anne's fire, crafting her image to appeal to a king who had grown weary of defiance. While Anne Boleyn's body still lay warm in the Tower of London, Jane was being measured for her wedding dress. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane. 11 days. There was no mourning period, no pause for reflection. The ink on Anne's death warrant had barely dried, and the throne already had a new queen. This rapid transition was no accident, it was a maneuver orchestrated by Jane's family and the king himself, designed to signal continuity, not chaos. Jane was not just a replacement, she was a political reset. From the beginning, Jane embodied everything Henry wanted the world to believe about her: docile, pure, submissive. She adopted the motto, bound to obey and serve, a stark contrast to Anne Boleyn's bold declaration, the most happy. Every aspect of Jane's public persona was carefully curated to distance her from the controversies of the past. She avoided political discussion, refrained from challenging Henry's decisions, and offered no opinions on matters of church or state. But behind this veil of obedience was a woman who understood exactly what was required to survive. Jane's silence was not weakness, it was strategy. She had witnessed firsthand what happened to queens who overstepped their bounds. Catherine of Aragon had been discarded after decades of marriage for failing to produce a male heir. Anne Boleyn had been executed on charges that were likely fabricated. Jane knew the cost of rebellion, and she was determined not to pay it. Her path to survival lay in conformity, in becoming the ideal Tudor wife, even if it meant erasing parts of herself in the process. Her family, too, understood the stakes. The Seymours were not just marrying into the royal family, they were seizing the chance to reshape their destiny. Edward Seymour, Jane's eldest brother, quickly became a trusted advisor to the king, rising in influence and securing positions of power. Thomas Seymour, the younger sibling, used his charm and cunning to build connections at court. Their sister's proximity to the throne became the key to unlocking wealth, titles, and access, and they would protect that key at any cost. Jane's every move was managed, every word measured, every appearance choreographed. She was instructed on how to speak to the king, how to walk beside him, how to express devotion without appearing eager. Her dresses were chosen not just for beauty, but for modesty. Her jewelry, her hairstyles, even the fabrics she wore were selected to reflect humility and virtue. In this carefully controlled environment, Jane became less a person and more a symbol, a living embodiment of obedience, purity, and feminine grace. But such a performance came at a cost. Jane's existence at court was one of constant vigilance. She lived in the shadow of two queens who had met vastly different but equally tragic ends. Catherine cast aside and exiled, Anne beheaded. Jane knew that the same fate awaited her if she failed in her one true task, bearing a son. She may have worn the crown, but she was never safe. The throne beneath her feet was built on the broken bodies of women who had failed to meet the king's expectations. The court, ever hungry for intrigue, watched Jane with relentless scrutiny. Gossip whispered through palace halls. Would she succeed where others failed? Was she truly as virtuous as she appeared? Some viewed her with sympathy. Others, especially those loyal to Anne, saw her as a traitor. After all, Jane had accepted Henry's proposal while Anne was still queen. Some accused her of moral cowardice, of betrayal, even of complicity in Anne's downfall. But Jane was not interested in being liked. She was interested in surviving. And survival meant staying quiet, staying obedient, and most importantly, getting pregnant. Henry, for all his political bluster, remained singularly obsessed with producing a male heir. He had daughters Mary from Catherine, Elizabeth from Annabut. He viewed them both as inadequate, even illegitimate. Only a son could ensure the continuation of the Tudor dynasty, and only a woman who could give him that son would be truly secure. Jane's role was clear from the moment she entered Henry's bed. She was a vessel, not a partner, a means to an end. The irony, of course, is that Jane succeeded where her predecessors failed. She did what Catherine could not, and what Anne was executed for failing to do. She bore Henry a son, and yet her success would be her undoing. In giving Henry what he wanted most, she sealed her own fate. Her usefulness ended the moment her son took his first breath. She had climbed to the pinnacle of power, but that power was never hers. It belonged to Henry, to the crown, to the system that elevated and discarded women with brutal efficiency. Jane Seymour was never meant to be a queen in the romantic sense. She was a strategic choice, a carefully cultivated tool of royal ambition. And when her role was fulfilled, she was quietly pushed aside, first in life, then in memory. History would remember her kindly. Songs would be written, portraits painted. She would be called the beloved wife, the true queen, the mother of the heir. But all of this was performance. All of it was fiction crafted to comfort a nation and glorify a king. The truth is more painful. Jane Seymour was not cherished, she was used. And like so many women in Henry's orbit, she paid the ultimate price for her proximity to power. The pressure of pregnancy, Jane Seymour, and the weight of a dynasty. From the moment she became queen, Jane Seymour understood her mission with chilling clarity. Bear a male heir, become another royal failure. There was no room for delay, no time for sentiment. Henry VIII had already discarded 2 wives, Catherine of Aragon for her inability to produce a surviving son, and Anne Boleyn for a string of miscarriages and the absence of that long-awaited male child. Jane knew the pattern. She knew what happened to women who failed the crown. Her position, her safety, her very life hung in the balance. Her womb had become a battlefield, her body a vessel for the Tudor dynasty's survival. The moment Jane married Henry in May 1536, the countdown began. Every passing month without news of a pregnancy heightened the tension at court. Courtiers speculated in hushed voices, watching Jane's figure for any subtle change. Was she gaining weight? Was her skin glowing? Was she sick in the mornings? Every facial expression, every complaint of fatigue, every skipped meal became cause for whispers. Jane wasn't just queen, she was public property. Her body was no longer her own. Her ladies-in-waiting tracked her menstrual cycles with clinical precision, as if scanning a royal calendar for signs of national fortune. Physicians examined her regularly under the guise of concern, but truly out of fear that yet another queen would prove barren. Jane, under the intense gaze of a court desperate for a son, lived in constant, suffocating surveillance. She smiled dutifully, spoke softly, and bore the pressure in silence. But the weight of expectation pressed down on her with every breath she took. At night, when the halls of Hampton Court fell quiet, the fear crept in. The same fear that had plagued Catherine, that had broken Anne. What if her body failed her? What if her worth, her survival, her very identity as queen vanished in the blood of a miscarriage? Pregnancy was not just personal, it was political. Henry had restructured the entire English church to marry Anne Boleyn. He had risked excommunication, war, and civil unrest all to produce a male heir, and that gamble had failed. With Jane, he had chosen caution. She was obedient, pious, quiet, everything Anne had not been. But if she too failed to bear a son, Henry's dreams would shatter. The legitimacy of the Tudor line would be called into question. The court would descend into chaos. When Jane finally conceived in early 1537, the air at court shifted. A sigh of relief swept through the royal chambers. The pressure did not vanish, it intensified. Now Jane had to protect the fragile life growing within her. No misstep could be tolerated. Her health, her movements, her diet, every detail was managed, restricted, controlled. She was ordered to rest, to avoid stress, to stay indoors. But the walls of the palace, thick with intrigue and suspicion, offered no real sanctuary. Special apartments were prepared for her. Curtains were drawn, lights dimmed, and the noise of court life muffled. She was wrapped in warmth, fed carefully curated meals, and watched day and night. Not out of affection, but out of necessity. She was not a queen in those moments, she was a precious vessel. Henry visited Jane frequently during her pregnancy, but even his affection had conditions. He wasn't concerned for her comfort, was concerned for the child. Every touch, every word, every decision revolved around the boy he hoped was growing inside her. Even the physician's attention leaned more toward the future heir than the woman carrying him. Jane was reduced to a symbol, a divine container, and yet she bore it all with composure, or at least the appearance of it. Her motto, bound to obey and serve, was never more literal than during these months. She accepted her confinement, submitted to the regulations, and endured the loneliness that came with such isolation. Few visitors were allowed, physical activity was limited. The most minor symptoms, dizziness, swelling, fatigue, became crises, and still she said nothing. Because to complain was to seem ungrateful, and to seem ungrateful was to appear unfit. Inside her private chambers, Jane's world grew smaller. The fresh air of the gardens, the laughter of courtly banter, the sense of life beyond duty of it disappeared. Her life became one long wait. Waiting for kicks in the womb, waiting for doctors to check her pulse, waiting for messages from the king, waiting, most of all, for labor to begin and for her to finally be free of the burden that had consumed her. But freedom was never part of the deal. As the months passed and her body grew heavier, Jane's physical strength began to fade. Her joints ached, her appetite waned, her mood dimmed. It is likely she experienced prenatal depression, though such a term did not exist at the time. She was expected to smile through it, to remain hopeful, to radiate joy at her role as mother of the heir. But her isolation was a kind of imprisonment, and the fear never left her. She had seen what happened to queens who failed. By the end of September 1537, Jane was moved to Hampton Court Palace for her confinement, the final stretch of pregnancy before labor. The rooms were sealed off to outside influence. Only women, her ladies and midwives, were allowed near her. The chambers were decorated richly, not for her comfort, but for tradition. The opulence of the birthing room was a statement to foreign ambassadors. England's royal lineage would soon be secured. Yet, inside those velvet-draped walls, Jane lay alone. She was surrounded by people, but alone in her anxiety. No one could truly protect her from what was to come. Tudor medicine was a grim affair, superstition, and trial and error took the place of science. Midwives and physicians, despite their rank, lacked real knowledge of childbirth complications, and in royal births, the priority was always the child, never the mother. Orders had been given. If complications arose, save the baby. Jane knew this. She had likely heard it said aloud. Her life, precious in theory, was expendable in practice. It was an accepted fact of queenship. To die in childbirth was an honorable fate if it produced a male heir. But for Jane, the honor was hollow. She had no guarantee of survival. And worse, she had no guarantee she would even be remembered as more than a means to an end. The tension reached its peak in early October. Henry became restless. He visited less frequently, delegating the waiting to his courtiers. Ambassadors sent frantic letters to their sovereigns. The entire kingdom held its breath. And inside the Queen's chambers, Jane prepared to do what no other wife of Henry had done: give him a living son. The pressure was more than psychological, it was national. England's religious future hung in the balance. Protestant reformers viewed the birth of a male heir as validation of Henry's break from the Catholic Church. Catholic loyalists hoped the child would bring moderation or even reconciliation. Every faction had a stake in Jane's pregnancy. Every noble family watched the outcome like gamblers eyeing a final bet. Her womb was not just a source of life, it was a crucible for political identity. Jane was no longer a woman. She was destiny incarnate. And that destiny would demand everything she had. The nightmare of labor and royal indifference. The evening of the 9th of October, 1537, brought with it the stillness of anticipation, a hush that fell across Hampton Court Palace like the calm before a storm. Inside the Queen's chambers, the long-awaited moment had arrived. Jane Seymour, Queen of England and third wife of Henry VIII, had gone into labor. The court was electrified. Messengers stood ready at every corridor, servants hurried through candlelit hallways, and physicians gathered their crude instruments, more symbolic than effective. For the past 9 months, the eyes of the kingdom had watched Jane's belly swell with the weight of royal destiny. Now, that destiny pressed against her from the inside, demanding to be born regardless of the cost. It would be the beginning of an ordeal that would last over 2 agonizing days and nights. Jane's labor was prolonged, intense, and nightmarishly painful. In the 16th century, childbirth was perilous, even under the best conditions. For royal women, the danger was multiplied not because they lacked access to care, but because the care itself was bound by ignorance, protocol, and male ambition. Physicians understood little of obstetrics. They believed in balancing bodily humors and bleeding away illness. They relied on herbal poultices, whispered prayers, and the experience of other noble women rather than science. As the hours dragged into day and back again into night, the mood in Jane's chamber turned desperate. She moaned through contractions with no anesthesia, no sterile instruments, no clear knowledge of what was happening inside her body. Her attendants were helpless, offering comfort where they could, but powerless in the face of a birth that would not progress. Jane was fading. Her strength ebbed with every spasm of pain, every cry that echoed against the velvet-hung walls. Outside her chambers, Henry VIII waited. But he did not pace with worry for his wife. He paced for his son. What mattered now was the child, not the woman giving birth to him. The court understood this instinctively. All eyes turned toward the outcome. Would it be a boy? Would he be healthy? What would it mean for the future of the Tudor dynasty? These were the questions that mattered. Jane's suffering was incidental. Some historians believe that in their desperation to deliver the child, the attending physicians may have performed a crude cesarean sectioner, attempted an invasive procedure now lost to time. There is no surviving confirmation, but what is clear is that Jane's body was pushed to the brink. By the time her son finally emerged, sometime early on the 12th of October, she was barely conscious. The child was healthy, a boy. Prince Edward had been born legitimate, living, and strong. The kingdom erupted in celebration. Bells rang in every church. Cannons thundered across the Thames. Bonfires were lit in the streets. The dream that had eluded Henry VIII for over 20 years had finally come true. A male heir, the continuation of the Tudor line, had been secured, and Jane Seymour, the woman who made it possible, was quietly left to die. In the hours after the birth, attention shifted immediately to the prince. Physicians flocked to his side. Noblewomen carried messages throughout the palace. Henry beamed with pride, already discussing plans for Edward's christening. And Jane? She lay bleeding, her sheets soaked with blood, her body weak and unresponsive. The focus had shifted. The Queen had served her purpose. Modern historians and medical experts believe Jane suffered from postpartum hemorrhage, potentially complicated by retained placenta, infection, or even uterine rupture. These are conditions that, by today's standards, could have been treated with routine procedures and basic medical supplies. But in 1537, they were a death sentence, especially when the physicians refused to act with urgency. Jane's condition grew worse by the hour. Fever set in. She grew delirious. Her skin turned pale, her breath shallow. Her bedchamber became a tomb in waiting, filled with the stench of blood and the silence of resignation. Those around her understood what was happening, and yet they did nothing. Some accounts suggest that Henry visited her briefly, offered a few kind words, and returned to his duties. Others say he avoided her entirely, unwilling to face the consequences of what he had demanded. After all, the son had been born. The Queen had fulfilled her role. What more was required of her? In one chilling report, Henry is alleged to have remarked, "Wives can be found easily enough." Whether or not he spoke these exact words, his actions told the same story. There was no panic, no royal command to save her, no desperation for a miracle. The king, who had executed one wife and divorced another, now allowed the third to bleed out slowly, silently, and with the full knowledge of his court. Jane lingered for nearly 12 days. 12 days of infection, fever, and internal decay. Physicians made gestures treating her with ineffective herbs, bleeding her further, administering purges and prayers. But these treatments did more harm than good. They were not based on compassion or urgency. They were rituals meant to preserve appearances, to say they had tried. In truth, Jane was abandoned by the very people she had elevated. Her family, the Seymours, focused on their newfound access to power. Her husband fixated on the prince. The court, ever eager to move forward, had already begun rewriting Jane's story. She would be remembered not as a dying woman, but as a martyr. A queen who had willingly sacrificed herself for the good of England. A romantic fiction that covered the truth like a burial shroud. And what was that truth? That Jane Seymour, a woman of flesh and blood, had been treated as a disposable object. Her body was used, her death accepted, her suffering ignored. When she finally passed on the 24th of October, 1537, the nation mourned her, not because they had truly loved her, but because she had given them what they wanted. Portraits were commissioned, poems were written. Henry declared that she would be buried with honor, and when he himself died a decade later, he chose to be buried beside her. But this final act, like all the others, was not born from affection. It was political. Jane was the mother of his heir, the most useful of all his wives. Her memory, therefore, was worth preserving. The nightmare of Jane Seymour's labor and death exposes more than the cruelty of Henry VIII reveals the cold machinery of Tudor power. In this world, women were vessels, queens were tools. Their lives were measured in bloodlines, and their worth ended the moment their function was fulfilled. Jane's tragedy is often overshadowed by the drama of Anne Boleyn's execution or the heartbreak of Catherine of Aragon's exile. But in many ways, her story is even darker. Because she did everything right. She obeyed, she submitted, she delivered a son, and still she died alone, in pain, without protection. There were no swords, no trials, no public disgrace, just a slow, indifferent death beneath royal sheets while England celebrated. Death, propaganda, and the myth of the perfect queen. Jane Seymour's body was still warm when the stories began. The Queen of England, who had given Henry VIII his long-awaited male heir, lay dead in her blood-stained bed at Hampton Court. She had endured 12 days of agony after childbirth, 12 days of slow bleeding, fever, and abandonment. Yet the moment she died, she was reborn in legend. Almost overnight, the machinery of royal propaganda stirred into motion. It didn't begin with mourn, it began with crafting a narrative. Jane Seymour would not be remembered as a woman neglected and discarded. She would be immortalized as a martyr, a saintly queen who gave her life for the future of England. The real woman, exhausted, used, and forgotten, was buried not only in stone and earth, but beneath layers of carefully manufactured myth. It was convenient for Henry. Jane had done what the others could not. Catherine of Aragon had given him a daughter but not a son. Anne Boleyn had given him a daughter as well, and a legacy of scandal and controversy. But quiet, pious, obedient, John had given him Edward. That alone made her invaluable in death, even if she had been expendable in life. So Henry embraced the image of the grieving widower. He commissioned elaborate funeral arrangements. Jane was wrapped in cloth of gold and placed in a coffin of oak. A procession led her body through the misty autumn air to Windsor Castle, where she would be interred at St. George's Chapel, the same resting place Henry would choose for himself. This decision, often presented as an act of love, was far more strategic. Jane, as the mother of the heir, was the most politically useful wife for Henry to be buried beside. In death, she represented dynastic legitimacy, not romantic devotion. Court poets quickly penned verses of praise. They depicted Jane as a paragon of womanhood, modest, gentle, selfless. They wrote that she had given her life gladly for her son and king. Royal painters were instructed to capture her image as serene and composed, forever fixed in a state of noble sacrifice. The suffering and medical neglect were erased. There were no portraits of Jane in childbirth. No poems about her 12 days of torment. Only the illusion remained. But this transformation was not just about honoring Jane. It was about protecting the king. Henry VIII had now lost 3 queens. The public needed a palatable explanation. They needed reassurance that their monarch was not reckless or cursed, but simply a victim of fate, and that Jane, unlike her predecessors, had fulfilled her role with grace. Elevating Jane to near sainthood served to justify her death and, by extension, Henry's ongoing quest for heirs. Behind the palace walls, however, the truth still lingered. Some courtiers knew that Jane had been left unattended, that her needs had been secondary to those of the infant prince, that Henry had shown little urgency even as her life slipped away. There were rumors that she had been sacrificed for the dynasty, or even that her death had been allowed, perhaps welcomed, to avoid another complex annulment should she fail to conceive again. After all, what could be more convenient than a queen who delivered a son and then died before she could fall out of favor? The propaganda drowned out the whispers. In the years that followed, Jane's image continued to evolve. She became the ideal Tudor queen in popular imagination, submissive, chaste, and fertile. The reality that she had likely been coerced into silence, that she had lived under extreme surveillance, and that her body had been used and discarded was buried deeper with each passing decade. Her family, the Seymours, benefited tremendously from her sacrifice. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas, leveraged their connection to the prince to rise rapidly at court. Edward Seymour would later become Lord Protector of England during Edward VI's minority, effectively ruling the kingdom. Their sister's death had opened doors of power and influence that would have otherwise remained closed. In the cold calculation of Tudor politics, Jane's life had been well spent. But what did Jane gain? She left behind no letters, no personal writings, no record of her thoughts in those final days. Her silence enforced in life became permanent in death. Even her religious piety, often celebrated, was used to frame her demise as divinely ordained. Protestants portrayed her death as a sacrifice for the Reformed faith, while Catholics saw it as divine punishment for Henry's break with Rome. Jane became a canvas upon which both sides painted their beliefs. Her humanity was erased. The only thing that remained was the boy. Prince Edward, fragile, solemn, and politically priceless, grew up under the heavy weight of his mother's sacrifice. He would reign for only 6 years before dying at 15, but even during his short life, Jane's status as his mother shielded her memory. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who was reviled and blamed, or Catherine of Aragon, who was mourned and pitied, Jane was honored. Her story, no matter how fabricated, served the state. The legend of Jane Seymour endured through the centuries. In historical fiction, she is often the good wife, the quiet one, the one who didn't cause trouble, the one Henry truly loved. But this narrative overlooks the brutal reality of what she endured. She lived in a gilded cage. She was not cherished, she was instrumentalized. She did not die in gentle slumber, but in agony, surrounded by indifference. Her legacy is not romantic, it is tragic. To speak honestly about Jane Seymour is to confront the cruelty of Tudor politics. It is to admit that even queens, especially queens, were disposable, that their value was tied directly to their fertility, that obedience was not rewarded with protection, but with neglect. Jane's real tragedy is not that she died giving birth, it is that her death was framed as beautiful when it was anything but, that the court mourned her usefulness, not her person. And yet, her myth remains stubbornly intact. Tourists visit Windsor Castle and admire the tomb that Henry VIII shares with Jane Seymour. Guides speak of their eternal union. Textbooks still label her as Henry's favorite. And perhaps she was, because she gave him what he wanted and then conveniently disappeared. But we must not mistake convenience for love. The real Jane Seymour deserves to be remembered, not as a silent angel of submission, but as a woman caught in the jaws of a patriarchal system too powerful to resist. She was obedient, yes, but also observant. Careful, political. She played her role as best she could in a game that offered no safe exits. Her story is not one of gentle sacrifice, but of calculated use and silent suffering. To see her clearly is to dismantle the fantasy that surrounds Henry's court. It is to reckon with the truth that even the most perfect queen could not escape the fate of being forgotten the moment she was no longer needed, and that her greatest success, giving Henry a son, was also the very thing that killed her. Legacy, power, and the female body in Tudor England. Jane Seymour's death marked not just the end of a queen's life, it marked the brutal culmination of a system that reduced royal women to their reproductive function. In the cold, calculated machinery of Tudor power, she was both a success and a sacrifice. She delivered England a male heir and was discarded the moment her body had fulfilled that role. But Jane's legacy, while shaped by myth and political propaganda, forces us to confront a darker reality, one that extends far beyond the walls of Hampton Court or the romanticized tomb at Windsor Castle. Her story is a window into the expendability of even the most exalted women in a patriarchal society that valued lineage over life, symbols over souls. Jane's body had become a political vessel, watched, monitored, controlled. From the moment she was married, her identity was defined entirely by her fertility. Her every movement was scrutinized not for who she was, but for what she might produce. When she finally conceived, the royal court transformed her into a sacred object, and her pregnancy became a national obsession. But once the heir was safely born, her personal value expired. Her death, likely preventable with even the most basic medical knowledge today, was accepted without question. Physicians ignored her needs. The court shifted its focus to the newborn prince. Henry VIII, the man who claimed to love her most, did not mourn with sincerity. Instead, he chose to preserve her memory only because it served his narrative, the perfect, submissive queen who died so that England might live on. Yet behind the legend lies a deeply human tragedy. Jane Seymour's fate wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that repeated endlessly across Tudor England and beyond. Women used, praised, and sacrificed in the name of dynasty, religion, and power. Her silence, often mistaken for virtue, was a necessity. Her obedience, lauded by historians, was survival. And her death, glorified in retrospect, was the natural consequence of a system that never saw her as fully human. Even centuries later, Jane remains trapped in that mythology. Popular portrayals continue to paint her as the best of Henry's wives, the quiet success story among a string of failures. But in reality, her story is not one of love or triumph. It is a story of confinement, manipulation, and abandonment. In remembering Jane Seymour truthfully, we must look beyond the golden tomb, beyond the carefully curated portraits. We must see the woman behind the myth, a queen who lived under impossible pressure, who bore the crown's greatest hope, and who died in its cruelest silence. Her legacy is not just Edward VI. It is a haunting lesson about the cost of power and the women who were made to pay it.